In the cold early morning of April 26, 2008, Springfield, a quiet Missouri town, awoke unaware that it would experience a day forever etched in its history. It was just after 3 in the morning when state police patrol cars surrounded a house that, to neighbors, seemed just another one among many others in the area. A 2-story house with a simple facade, an unkempt garden, and curtains always drawn. No one suspected that, behind those walls, a disturbing secret lurked. The neighborhood's silence was shattered by the metallic sound of battering rams striking the door. Heavily armed police officers stormed the home in an operation planned down to the last detail. The target wasn't drugs, nor weapons, but something far worse, and at the same time unimaginable. Inside the house, narrow hallways, a heavy, stuffy atmosphere, antique furniture covered in dust. While part of the team searched each room, other officers focused on a specific spot in the basement. There was something strange there, something striking, a poorly finished wall, marks of fresh cement, a strange, almost metallic smell. It was then that, with sledgehammers and heavy tools, they began to tear down the plaster. Behind this makeshift structure, a metal hatch appeared, so carefully hidden that, had it not been for the investigators' insistence, it might have gone unnoticed. The sound of the iron being broken echoed through the basement, and each knock increased the agents' tension. What was there? A hiding place? A secret storage room? The truth was about to be revealed. When they finally forced open the hatch, the heavy air that escaped brought with it a smell of mold and years of accumulated damp. The officers descended a narrow staircase, shining their flashlights into a claustrophobic tunnel that seemed endless. The environment was cold and damp, the walls covered in raw concrete, and at the end of the corridor, a locked steel door. As they broke it down, the scene that appeared before in them paralyzed even the most experienced agents. A small, suffocating underground room, furnished with a makeshift bed, a bucket for basic necessities, and scattered food scraps. There, sitting in a corner, her eyes half closed against the glare of the flashlights, was a thin, pale woman, her hair disheveled, her clothes torn. 20 years of silence and pain, hidden beneath the feet of an entire neighborhood. Shock gripped the team. Some officers had to fight back tears as they realized this. Young woman wasn't a lifeless body, but a survivor. She blinked slowly, tried to speak, but only a whisper escaped her parched lips. And in that instant, everyone understood that the story that was just beginning was much darker than anyone could have imagined. Stories like this leave no one indifferent. It's impossible to hear about someone being locked for 20 years beneath an entire neighborhood and not feel a lump in your throat, not get goosebumps, not think about how many secrets might still be hidden out there. You who are here now are exactly the kind of person who not only listens, but feels every detail, who gets involved with every mystery, every twist, every shocking discovery. That's why I want you with me in this community that doesn't let these stories get lost, that insists on telling how everything really happened, without cuts, without romanticization, just the raw, breathtaking truth. Be a part of this with me. Like this video and click subscribe to the channel now, because there are still many mysteries, disappearances, and dramatic rescues that need to be revealed. And I want you here, experiencing each one of them with me. Emily Johnson was born on February 5, 1989, in Springfield, Missouri. She was the only child of George Allen Johnson and Mary Elizabeth Johnson. To those who knew her as a child, Emily seemed to have an ordinary life, full of dreams and plans for the future. She was described as a sweet, studious girl, always willing to help others. In elementary school, teachers remember her as a curious student who loved writing essays and had a special way with storytelling. Some classmates still remember the sparkle in her eyes when she talked about becoming a psychologist, about helping people going through difficult times. It seemed like the destiny of someone born to make a difference. But behind this image, There were signs that her life at home was not as simple as it seemed. Her mother, Mary Elizabeth, was seen as a quiet, dedicated woman, but already weakened by health problems. Neighbors report that in her later years, Mary always seemed tired and haggard, as if carrying more weight than she could handle. Her father, George, was the opposite in appearance. A man with a strong presence, a manual worker, always active in the neighborhood but also very reserved, not very open to social interaction. Those who lived near the family say it was difficult to imagine Emily playing in the backyard or entertaining new friends at home. The curtains were almost always closed, and the house had an air of isolation, as if to ward off the curious gaze of passers-by. Still, no one suspected anything at the time. After all, Springfield was a quiet town, where everyone believed they knew their neighbors. During her adolescence, Emily began to show signs of wanting to escape this silent routine. She participated in book clubs, excelled in school competitions, and was already talking about applying for scholarships to the University of Missouri. Teachers reported that she had a thirst for learning and that her work always exceeded expectations. But at the same time, some noticed a strange behavior. She rarely spoke about her home life. While classmates talked about family outings, trips, or simple everyday moments, Emily always changed the subject. When asked about her father, she would smile nervously and change the subject. These details, which at the time seemed merely shy, took on new meaning years later, when the truth came out. A defining moment in her youth was her close relationship with her Aunt Susan, her mother's sister. Unlike the controlled environment of the Johnson home, Susan offered Emily a space of freedom. It was at her aunt's house that Emily experienced lighter moments, late-night movies, long conversations, and confidences she never dared share with her parents. Susan believed her niece had a promising future and made a point of encouraging her to pursue her dreams. Perhaps that's why, after Mary's death in 2002, Emily became even more attached to her aunt as a supportive figure. But it was her mother's death that changed the course of her life forever. With the loss of Mary, George transformed completely. Neighbors report that he became even more reclusive, aggressive toward any attempts to get close, and obsessed with strange renovations around the house. Meanwhile, Emily, then 13, began to live under much tighter control. Later accounts revealed that George said that the outside world was too dangerous, and that no one would care about her except him. It was as if the tragedy of his wife's death had awakened in him an unhealthy need to keep his daughter under constant surveillance. To her school friends, Emily began to disappear from social activities, declining invitations and avoiding gatherings. Gradually, her presence became increasingly rare until she disappeared completely. The detail that many only realized later was how much Emily seemed to be preparing for something, even if unconsciously. Some colleagues remember letters she wrote about wanting to escape Springfield, about how she dreamed of living in a big city, meeting new people, studying, working, being independent. There was a tone of urgency in her words, as if she knew time was running out. One of these letters, found years later among the belongings stored by Aunt Susan, read, "One day I will get out of here, Auntie. I know I can. I just need courage." This phrase would become a symbol of the case when the story became public, but there was also a darker side to her adolescence. Classmates recall that, on rare occasions, Emily would show up at school with strange marks on her arms or face. When questioned, she would say she had fallen or tripped. Teachers suspected domestic abuse, but without concrete evidence, nothing was done. These signs, which could have made a difference, were ignored or downplayed, and life went on as if nothing was happening. Over time, Emily faded from the community's collective memory. First, she stopped attending school clubs. Then she skipped classes, until in 2003 she no longer showed up at school. Records show that George officially announced that his daughter had dropped out, claiming she wasn't adapting and preferred to stay home. The school, lacking sufficient resources to challenge this, accepted his version. It was Emily's first official erasure from public life, the first step toward her disappearing without a trace. Little by little, Springfield began to forget about her. Some neighbors still wondered from time to time what had happened to that sweet girl, but no one insisted on seeking answers. Only Susan, her aunt, continued to demand information, never accepting the version that her niece had simply run away from home. She told everyone that Emily wasn't that kind of person, that she would never have disappeared without saying goodbye. People listened, but the lack of evidence made her words sound like nothing more than the grief of a distraught aunt. The most striking thing is realizing how all these details, so clear today, were before everyone's eyes, yet went unnoticed. The young woman full of dreams, who talked about studying psychology, who wrote letters about running away, who remained silent when the subject was her father, already left signs that something very wrong was happening inside that house. But no one connected the dots. No one suspected that behind the always closed curtains, a prison was about to be built. And it was precisely at this point, after her mother's death and her daughter's total isolation, that George began something that would change the history of Springfield forever. Because while everyone continued to believe Emily had simply dropped out of school, inside her house a much darker destiny was already being drawn. In September 2003, the Johnson family took the first official step toward understanding Emily's disappearance. The person who took the lead was Mary's sister, Susan Miller, who had never accepted the silence surrounding her niece's whereabouts. Susan went to the local police station and filed a police report. In the report, she stated that Emily was missing, that she hadn't shown any signs of life, and that there were strange circumstances surrounding the case. She insisted that her niece wasn't a young woman who would simply run away without a trace. She always talked to me, always told me things. If she had run away, I would have known, Susan said in her statement. The problem was that for the police, the situation was treated as just another case of a runaway teenager. In the United States, this type of report was common and often trivialized. The belief that young people disappeared by choice, often to escape parental authority or seek a new life, led to Emily's case being classified as a runaway case. And that's when everything started to go wrong. Official records show that the initial investigation was superficial, almost formal. Agents visited the Johnson home, asked George a few quick questions, and closed the case based on his father's version of events. George said Emily had behavioral problems, ran with the wrong crowd, had dropped out of school, and had likely left on her own. This narrative, though flimsy, was enough for the police. There was no detailed search of the home, no interviews with neighbors, and no analysis of the young woman's recent movements. Only a cold document stating possible voluntary absconding. With that, the case was provisionally closed, but in practice, forgotten. Susan never believed this story. She knew her niece wasn't the kind of person who would disappear without even leaving a message, a note. Furthermore, Emily's relationship with her father was already considered difficult, but there was no indication she had any plans to disappear. On the contrary, Emily was determined to study, had clear plans to apply for scholarships, and made no secret of her desire to leave Springfield legitimately, not as a fugitive. This discrepancy between what her aunt knew and what the police recorded was one of the first mistakes that delayed the rescue for almost 2 decades. The scariest thing is that there were already small signs that something was wrong. Neighbors reported hearing strange noises coming from George's basement around that time. Muffled knocks, furniture dragging, metallic sounds during the early hours. But no one thought it could be serious. After all, everyone trusted the good, hard-working man George seemed to be. Some even believed he was renovating the house after his wife's death. The problem is, no one looked deeper. No one really investigated. These reports were never officially reported to the police. In the 2003 files, there's a revealing detail. Susan requested a formal search of the house, but the request was ignored because George was considered a grieving father, a man suffering from the loss of his wife and his daughter's alleged rebellion. George's own public image helped silence suspicions. He was seen as a hard-working man who maintained a certain respectability among his neighbors, and no one imagined he could hide something so cruel. This weight of social appearance ended up being a shield that shielded the criminal for years. As the investigation fizzled, George began to shape his narrative. He told acquaintances that Emily had run away with an older boyfriend, hinting that she might be in another city, perhaps even another state. Some neighbors even believed this story, even though it was unproven. With each repetition of this lie, the image of Emily as a young runaway was cemented, while the truth, buried beneath concrete, remained invisible. Susan's frustration grew year after year. She called the police, sought information, and reviewed the case, but always ran into the same wall: lack of evidence. In 2004, she even organized small community searches, posting posters with her niece's photo in supermarkets and neighboring police stations. The images showed Emily smiling, young and full of life. But as time passed, attention faded. Springfield was a town where serious crime was rare, and people quickly became accustomed to believing this was just another story about a teenager who chose to disappear. This institutional neglect not only delayed the outcome, but also created a deep wound in the family. For Susan, it felt like screaming alone amidst a collective silence. For Michael, Emily's cousin, who was still young at the time, the disappearance became a ghost that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He grew up hearing that his cousin had run away, but always suspected there was something more, something never told. These doubts would fuel the reopening of the case years later. What's most outrageous is that, looking back now, it's clear there was enough evidence to at least suspect something darker. Emily had no history of delinquency, no record of drug use, and no history of previous runaways. On the contrary, her academic life and social circle demonstrated stability and focus. The theory that she had disappeared voluntarily didn't hold up under closer scrutiny, but due to a lack of serious investigation, the story continued as official truth. Meanwhile, reality was different. While the police reports gathered dust in drawers, Emily was already locked in a dark space, living a routine of enforced silence, with no one listening to her cries for help. The world went on, as if nothing had happened. Springfield continued its peaceful routine, and only one house stood out, always closed, always silent, hiding within its foundations, a secret no one dared imagine. That first clue, recorded in 2003, became the starting point for the entire story, but also the authorities' first major failure. It was the ignored warning that could have changed everything, because if, back then, someone had insisted on looking deeper, perhaps Emily's fate would have been different. Perhaps 20 years of pain could have been avoided. But that wasn't what happened. And it was precisely the negligence in the face of this disappearance that paved the way for the dark pattern that would begin to emerge in the following years. Going through old papers, forgotten receipts in drawers, and even seemingly trivial purchase receipts, it was Emily's cousin, Michael Johnson, who began to see what no one had noticed for years. As an adult, he never accepted the official explanation that his cousin had simply run away from home. In 2015, while helping his Aunt Susan organize boxes of old family documents, he found something that caught his eye: a series of receipts for construction materials purchased by Emily's father, George, the very year she disappeared. The strangest thing was the type of material: large quantities of cement, steel bars, industrial fans, and sheet metal. It made no sense to someone who lived in a simple house with no apparent major renovations. Michael began to collect everything, every note, every detail. He assembled one folder, then another, until, without realizing it, he had a dossier in front of him. But that wasn't all. Talking to older neighbors, he gathered reports that around 2003 and 2004, strange noises were common coming from George's basement. Metallic sounds, like hammering, sometimes in the early hours of the morning. Some neighbors even joked that he was building a bunker or something similar. No one imagined there was so much truth to this macabre joke. What caught Michael's attention most was the consistency of these signs. While analyzing his credit card statements, he noticed recurring purchases at hardware stores over the course of months. By cross-referencing reports from neighbors, he was able to piece together a timeline of the work done inside the house. Every reported hammer blow, every package of cement purchased, seemed to fit into a dark puzzle. It wasn't just a renovation. It was something planned, meticulous, requiring time, money, and above all, secrecy. The curious thing is that George was always known as a man who liked to tinker around the house. This detail made any renovations go unnoticed. To the neighborhood, it was just another project by a widowed father trying to occupy his mind. But Michael noticed a crucial difference. After Emily's disappearance, the construction not only continued but intensified, as if something had begun right then. Another factor that reinforced suspicions was George's own behavior. Bank documents showed unexplained cash withdrawals. Energy reports from the local utility company indicated spikes in consumption at the residence, especially during the early hours of the morning, as if machines were running or fans were operating at unusual times. To Michael, it was clear. A secret routine was taking place within the house, and it coincided with his cousin's disappearance. But perhaps the most disturbing detail was uncovered in a seemingly ordinary conversation. In 2016, Michael reconnected with an old childhood friend who lived on the same street as the Johnsons. The young man confided in him that one time, while playing ball near the house, the ball landed near the basement window. As he approached to retrieve it, he swore he heard a faint voice, like a whisper asking for help. At the time, he thought he imagined it. He never told anyone. But when he recounted it to Michael so many years later, the memory fit with frightening force into the puzzle he had been piecing together. Michael compiled everything into a makeshift report, complete with dates, receipts, neighbors' accounts, and even hand-drawn maps. It was as if he were investigating a crime alone, without police support. With each new discovery, his anguish grew. He began to wonder if he was in danger. After all, messing with George's name meant poking at someone who had always silently instilled fear. Still, he didn't stop. His desire to discover the truth about Emily outweighed his fear. The pattern that emerged was clear. Emily's disappearance was anything but a voluntary escape. It was directly linked to the strange work her father was doing in the basement. Michael was convinced that this held the key to unraveling the mystery. But what he didn't know was that this dossier, assembled from scattered pieces of information ignored for years, would be the trigger for reigniting an investigation that had been buried by the police. And it was just when it seemed no one else was willing to listen that Michael decided to take the next step. He knew he needed to tell someone with the power to act. He just didn't realize that resistance from the authorities would be the next obstacle in his relentless search for answers. When Michael finally took the dossier he'd compiled to the Springfield police station in 2017, he believed it would have the impact he'd hoped for. He'd gathered entire folders of invoices, neighbors' accounts, electrical records, and even notes about nighttime noises coming from George's house. Everything was detailed, in chronological order, almost like a professional report. However, when he handed it over to investigators, the reaction was disappointing. The officers listened, leafed through some papers, made quick notes, but soon filed the case into the same old drawer: voluntary disappearance. For them, there was nothing there to justify a deeper investigation. Michael left feeling like he'd been talking to walls. The problem ran deeper than simple negligence. Internal reports uncovered years later made it clear that local authorities believed George's narrative. He was seen as a grieving widower, a father who, despite his strictness, had lost his daughter to the world of evil influences. To the police, he was more victim than suspect. This meant that any complaint or evidence against him was met with suspicion. "We cannot accuse a father without concrete evidence," they wrote in a memo at the time. This institutional stance became a nearly insurmountable barrier, and time only made things worse. With each passing year, Emily became more forgotten. Her name stopped being mentioned. The posters from the time of her disappearance disappeared from the walls, and Springfield returned to its quiet routine as if nothing had happened. For the neighbors, talking about Emily became uncomfortable. Many preferred to believe George's version of events rather than deal with the possibility that a horrific crime could be taking place right next door. This collective silence, this unspoken pact, was one of the kidnappers' greatest allies. Michael, however, didn't give up. Frustrated with the police's indifference, he began reaching out to local journalists. In 2018, he took some of the material to a reporter at the local newspaper. The story was drafted, but it was blocked before airing. The reason? The newspaper's management didn't want to publish something that could tarnish the reputation of a traditional family without more concrete evidence. Once again, the official version prevailed. The weight of George's image as a respectable man continued to act as a shield. Meanwhile, Susan, the elderly aunt, still insisted that her niece was alive. In later interviews, neighbors reported that she seemed obsessed with repeating the same phrase: "Emily is here. I feel it. She was never gone." To many, it was just the delusions of a woman devastated by grief. But to Michael, it was a constant reminder that he couldn't stop. The contrast between the family's persistence and the authorities' coldness was stark. The police claimed there wasn't enough evidence to warrant a search. The family claimed the evidence was there, but they simply weren't taking it seriously. This dispute created a tense atmosphere. Michael even openly argued with officers at community meetings, accusing them of negligence. "You want to wait until you find a body. Why are you the only one who's going to make a move?" he reportedly said on one such occasion, according to accounts from those present. Emily's case became, without anyone realizing it, a cruel example of how institutional failures can prolong a victim's suffering. Instead of taking action, authorities opted for inaction. Instead of distrusting what seemed all too obvious, they preferred to accept a convenient narrative. The result was that years passed without any real steps being taken. This neglect ultimately created space for George to move on with his life without arousing major suspicion. He continued to live in the same house, greeted neighbors with a discreet smile, and maintained his routine of temporary jobs. Nothing about him seemed to betray that in the basement of his own residence, a young woman was being held in inhumane conditions. It's frightening to think that the truth was so close to being discovered on several occasions, but was stifled by blind trust in a facade of normality. For Michael, each denial from the police was like a punch in the gut, but it also fueled the fire. If no one would listen, he would have to keep searching. He began studying similar cases in the United States, such as that of J.C. Dugard, kidnapped and held captive for 18 years in California, or the 3 women found in Cleveland after a decade of false imprisonment. These examples showed that the improbable could be real, that the impossible could be happening in Springfield. The authorities' negligence didn't erase the signals, but it delayed their interpretation. The pattern of silence and neglect repeated itself year after year, while Emily remained trapped in the basement. It was as if the entire town had been hypnotized by a convenient story, lacking the courage to face the truth. And it was precisely in this environment of distrust and closed doors that Michael decided to make a drastic decision, because he understood that if he waited for the authorities, he would never discover what had really happened to his cousin. Tired of collecting denials and seeing his efforts dismissed as exaggeration or paranoia, Michael made the decision that would change the course of the entire investigation. In 2019, he hired a private investigator. But not just anyone. He sought someone with real experience handling complex cases, someone who wasn't afraid to confront local authorities or break the comfortable narrative that had protected George Johnson for so many years. That's how he met Robert Hensley, a retired FBI agent known for his work on kidnapping and missing persons cases in the 1990s. Robert was no longer at the peak of his career, but he carried with him something that Michael desperately needed: credibility. Their first meeting took place in a cafe far from downtown Springfield. Michael brought with him the folder filled with years of notes, receipts, and testimonies. Robert listened in silence, with that look typical of someone who'd seen far more than he'd ever wanted. In the end, he closed the folder and simply said, "If half of this is true, your cousin never left this house." The sentence landed like a blow to Michael. It was everything he suspected, but hearing it from a seasoned professional gave his suspicions a weight they'd previously lacked. Robert wasted no time. His first step was to inspect George's residence from a distance. He drove by at different times, observing the lights, the movements, even the pattern of the curtains always being closed. He soon realized something was peculiar. During the early hours of the morning, slight variations in the basement's interior lighting suggested activity down below. It wasn't much, but for someone trained, it was enough to raise an alarm. Next, the researcher began using technological resources. Using discrete drones, he was able to map the house's grounds and identify suspicious ventilation points in the backyard, something that wouldn't make sense in a typical home. They were small pipes, but enough to ventilate an underground space. For Robert, this was practically confirmation. And when he cross-referenced these images with old receipts for construction materials collected by Michael, he realized that the pieces fit together in a frightening way. With each new discovery, Michael felt a mixture of relief and anguish. Relief that someone was finally taking his suspicions seriously. Anguish, because the more they uncovered, the more real the possibility became that Emily was there, alive, just a few feet away from everyone, but still out of reach. Robert also brought a colder investigative eye. He reviewed old police reports and found glaring inconsistencies. How could an investigation have been closed without even searching the basement? How could a single man's word be accepted without cross-checking basic information? These flaws were so glaring they almost seemed purposefully ignored. To Robert, there were only two explanations: either incompetence or expediency in avoiding someone respected in the community. Either way, the omission had cost him dearly. Michael, who until then had been fighting practically alone, now had a powerful ally. Sleepless nights were filled with long conversations, proofreading, and new hypotheses. They began to assemble a detailed map of the house, based on old floor plans obtained from the registry office and drone footage. This map revealed something striking. An area of the basement was not listed in any official records. It was as if it had been added later, surreptitiously. Even with so much evidence, there was still a formidable obstacle: transforming those findings into something convincing. Robert knew that without concrete proof, no judge would authorize a search operation. They needed something more, something irrefutable. That's when he decided to invest in prolonged surveillance. For months, he alternated observation times, noted George's unusual movements, and recorded muffled sounds picked up by directional microphones discreetly placed near the house. In some recordings, There were noises reminiscent of distant voices, impossible to clearly identify, but disturbing to those familiar with the story. With each new element, hope grew, but along with it came the weight of responsibility. Michael knew he was dealing with something dangerous. George was an unpredictable man, and if he somehow suspected he was being watched, he could destroy all the evidence and even end Emily's life if she were still there. This tension accompanied their every step, making the investigation almost unbearable. It was at this point that Michael realized her life had completely changed. She no longer thought about work, friends, or even her own health. Everything revolved around Emily. He felt indebted to his cousin, as if he had an obligation to do for her what no one else had done. Robert, with his experience, tried to maintain balance, but even he, accustomed to extreme situations, admitted there was something different about this case. It was as if all the signs screamed that they were facing a suffocating truth, ready to explode at any moment. And so, while Springfield went about its quiet business, two men worked in silence, connecting dots that the police had ignored for nearly 2 decades. Each clue, each discovery brought them closer to the truth. But at the same time, it increased. The risk of drawing too much attention to something George had been so carefully hiding. And it was in this climate of suspense, of partial discoveries and constant fear, that Michael and Robert understood they were about to cross a line from which there would be no return. With each new night of vigil, Michael felt the weight of his obsession becoming unbearable. Ever since Robert Hensley joined the investigation, everything revolved around Emily. Work, family, social life, nothing else seemed to matter. He spent hours reviewing the microphone recordings, watching drone footage over and over, searching for any detail that might indicate movement within the basement. It was as if he lived for an answer that never came. This constant search began to take a heavy toll. First came sleep. Michael wasn't sleeping well anymore. He stayed up late sifting through documents, retracing timelines and jotting down dates in notebooks that were piling up around his house. Then came his health. He lost weight rapidly, barely ate, and began living on coffee and cigarettes. Friends began to drift away, unable to understand his obsession. Some said he needed to accept the truth, that Emily should have been dead for years, that pursuing the case would only prolong his suffering. But for Michael, accepting meant giving up, and giving up was never an option. The tension even reached home. His wife, Rebecca, initially supported his dedication to her cousin's memory, but over time she began to see the investigation as a shadow destroying their marriage. In frequent arguments, she begged him to stop, to focus on the present, instead of living trapped in a past he could no longer change. "You'll lose yourself along with her," she said. But the more he heard these words, the more Michael became convinced he was on the right path. To him, it was as if Emily depended solely on him to get out of that place. Robert also sensed the strain, but knew there was no stopping someone so determined. He tried to set limits, suggested breaks, but the former agent himself was also too involved. Perhaps it was professional pride. Perhaps it was the feeling of being faced with the most enigmatic case of his life. Either way, he couldn't abandon the investigation. The two became inseparable partners, united by a truth that seemed close but always slipped through their fingers. Meanwhile, George remained untouched. Every time they passed him, his anger grew. He continued his discreet routine, greeting neighbors with the same serenity as always, as if nothing were wrong. For Michael, this image was unbearable. How could someone live so peacefully while hiding something so monstrous? This contradiction further fueled his obsession, and there was fear. Fear of being wrong, fear that it was all a delusion, fear of destroying his life in exchange for a non-existent truth. But there was also another, stronger fear, that of being right, that Emily really was there, alive, waiting for help. This thought wouldn't let him rest. Every time he tried to shut it off, he remembered Aunt Susan's words. "Emily is here. I feel it." That phrase repeated itself like a mantra, making him unable to stop. Personal costs began to pile up. Debts arose from surveillance equipment, travel and meetings with lawyers and journalists that never led anywhere. Michael's marriage was on the rocks, and his mental health was visibly deteriorating. He became increasingly isolated, avoiding family gatherings, abandoning hobbies, and retreating into a world where only investigation existed. And yet, no matter how heavy it was, there was always something that kept him going. Hope. It was this flame, almost invisible, that kept him going. Every strange noise in the recordings, every shadow captured by the drones, every new clue, no matter how small, renewed the feeling that they were getting closer. It was a dangerous game, but impossible to abandon. Robert, in his most candid conversations, even warned, "Michael, this kind of search consumes people. I've seen investigators destroy their lives chasing answers that never came." But Michael would only reply, "What if she's still there, waiting for me?" This simple and devastating question silenced any argument. The path became increasingly lonely. Friends gave up, family members lost patience, but Michael remained steadfast, because for him it wasn't just about Emily. It was about justice, about revealing the truth, about not allowing such a cruel story to be erased by indifference. And deep down, even though his life was falling apart, there was something inside him that told him the truth was about to come out. And it was exactly at that moment of maximum exhaustion, when everything seemed about to collapse, that an unexpected detail emerged, something small but strong enough to rekindle all hope and point to the next step on the path they could no longer abandon. The portrait of the antagonist begins to emerge more clearly when the layers of George Allen Johnson's life are slowly peeled back. On the surface, he was an ordinary man. Born in 1962, he grew up in Springfield, and to his neighbors, he was always a reserved, hard-working man who went about his daily life without attracting attention. He never got involved in public fights, had no criminal record, and to many even seemed exemplary. But when the lens zooms in, a much darker profile emerges. George was a man obsessed with control. From a young age, he had difficulty dealing with frustration and displayed authoritarian behavior at home. With his wife, Mary Elizabeth, he maintained a rigid relationship marked by rules and constant silence. After her death in 2002, this authoritarian streak transformed into something even deeper: paranoia. Accounts from acquaintances show that George began to believe the world was too dangerous. He said people were corrupt, that violence was increasing, that no one could be trusted. With the loss of his wife, this view worsened and focused on the only person left in his life, his daughter Emily. It was as if he had created a justification to transform his grief into a prison, convincing himself that keeping her away from the world was a way to protect her. Only this protection had another name: kidnapping. His obsession with control was reflected in every detail. George restricted Emily's friends, limited her school attendance, and monitored everything she did. When she started talking about studying abroad, it deeply angered him. Losing his daughter to the dangerous world he so feared was inconceivable to him. This distorted mindset led him to plan something that required calm, patience, and calculated coldness, transforming his basement into a prison. While everyone believed he was just a widower trying to renovate the house, he was building, piece by piece, the place where Emily would spend the next 20 years of her life. His neighbors, who always described him as polite, never imagined that behind that facade lay a man capable of such monstrosity. And perhaps that's the scariest part. George didn't fit the classic criminal stereotype. He wasn't violent in public, he didn't arouse suspicion, he didn't exhibit blatant behavior. His power lay precisely in his normalcy. He was the regular neighbor no one suspected, and that was precisely what allowed him to hide his secret for so long. Over time, subsequent interviews and psychological reports made it clear that George didn't act impulsively. He constructed a narrative to justify the crime, claiming he was protecting his daughter from the outside world. He believed, or at least kept repeating, that Emily would be safer trapped in the basement than living her own life. This protective delusion, coupled with his unhealthy control, fueled one of the most disturbing cases Springfield has ever known. And it's in this contrast between the public image of the common man and the reality of the cold, calculating kidnapper that the story gains even more power. Because while everyone believed Emily had simply run away, George walked around the neighborhood with the calm of someone who knew no one would ever dare look too deeply into his house. But there was one detail he couldn't control: small flaws, small clues that over time would begin to unravel the facade and reveal the true monster he was. In 2018, as Michael's investigation was already in full swing, an unexpected event shook the fragile network of silence that had protected George Johnson. A neighbor who had lived on the street for decades, Mr. Henry Walters, 67, received a letter in his mailbox with no return address. The envelope was crumpled, the paper yellowed, and the handwriting shaky, as if written in a hurry or by someone who didn't want to be recognized. The words, however, were direct and disturbing. "There's something wrong in that house. Listen carefully tonight. You'll understand." The message didn't name anyone, or specifically mention Emily, but everyone in the neighborhood knew who the note referred to. Walters, suspicious, discreetly mentioned it to two other nearby neighbors, but he didn't have the courage to take the note to the police. The note rekindled suspicions that some residents had been harboring in silence. Some swore they heard muffled noises, like low voices or even crying, coming from George's basement. Others said that some early mornings they saw strange lights turning on in the lower part of the house. But as always, the question remained: to what extent was it imagination? To what extent was it real? The fear of unfairly accusing someone considered respectable kept everyone to themselves. And George, skillful in his facade of a quiet man, continued to blend into the neighborhood routine as if nothing were happening. But this letter wasn't confined to Walters's mailbox. The story reached Michael. When he found out, he interpreted the note as confirmation of what he'd been investigating for years. Emily was alive and still trapped in the house. The discovery renewed his energy, but also brought with it a risk he hadn't anticipated. A few days later, he began receiving anonymous messages on his cell phone. At first, they were vague phrases like "stop digging" or "some secrets shouldn't be revealed." Later, the messages became more threatening. "You don't know who you're messing with, and if you continue, you'll regret it." The threats weren't limited to messages. One morning, when Michael went out to his car, he found the tire slashed by a sharp object. On another occasion, he noticed someone had tampered with his mailbox. There was no doubt in his mind. George had sensed the investigation was gaining momentum and was trying, in some way, to intimidate him. But the effect was the opposite. Instead of backing down, Michael became even more determined to press forward. This period was a watershed moment. For the first time, the community began to feel the weight of suspicion. The letter, the stories of noises, the threats, everything seemed to indicate that the mystery was not a figment of imagination, but rather a truth buried beneath concrete. Still, no one had the courage to go to the police. Fear paralyzed. George's power lay not in weapons or shouting, but in the silence he managed to impose on those around him. The anonymous note breached the wall of omission that had protected George for years. It showed that someone, at some point, knew too much, but it also cast a dangerous shadow over Michael and his family, because if George was willing to threaten, How far would he go to ensure his secret was never revealed? And it was precisely this tension, this interplay of suspicious glances and heavy silences in the neighborhood, that created the perfect setting for the next revelation. An even clearer piece of this puzzle that, little by little, was beginning to fall apart. By this point, the tension was unbearable. The anonymous letter, the threats against Michael, and the neighborhood's heavy silence created the perfect atmosphere for every new detail to be scrutinized. It was in this context that a decisive turning point emerged, the desperate search for concrete evidence that would, once and for all, link George Johnson to Emily's disappearance. Until then, all Michael and Robert Hensley had were strong clues, suspicious accounts, receipts for unusual purchases, and noises in the basement. But nothing that would truly convince the court to authorize forced entry into the house. They knew they needed something more, something impossible to ignore. The plan started out simple. Robert decided to use old city maps obtained from the city clerk's office and building records. The original plans for George's house, dating from the early 1970s, showed the basic structure. A two-story house with 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a living room, and a small basement. But when he compared these plans with drone images and modern measurements, a glaring discrepancy emerged. The actual basement space was larger than the officially registered one. This meant only one thing: there was an illegally constructed, unregistered area, an underground annex that, until then, no one knew about. Michael shivered when he saw the overlapping maps. It was as if the house hid a secret heart, beating underground, invisible to everyone. Robert, familiar with kidnapping cases, knew exactly what this meant. He built a bunker, he said with the coolness of someone who knew, no doubt, but it was still necessary to prove that this space was not just any construction site. It was necessary to show that Emily was there. The investigation gained an unexpected boost when Michael, through a contact at an energy company, gained access to detailed energy consumption records for the house. Over the years, even after Emily disappeared, the home's electricity bill showed constant spikes during the early morning hours. These spikes now coincided with periods when George claimed to be out of town working. If he wasn't home, who was consuming so much energy? This was the question that finally began to shape the impossible. Another disturbing fact came from the neighbors themselves. In discreet interviews conducted by Robert, some reported occasionally hearing muffled sounds coming from the basement. These weren't just metallic clangs, but something more unsettling. Footsteps, as if someone were walking in a confined space. And even murmurs that resembled voices. No one ever dared to investigate, but the echo of these stories added to the evidence Michael already had. The most dramatic part of the search was when Robert decided to take a bolder risk. One night when George wasn't home, he managed to install a directional microphone near one of the backyard vents. The equipment recorded hours of sounds, mostly just silence or wind noises. But at certain moments it picked up something that gave everyone goosebumps. A repetitive rhythmic sound that sounded like faint tapping against a surface. And in one of the recordings, barely audible, a faint female voice, as if asking for help. The recording wasn't clear and couldn't be used officially as evidence. But for Michael, it was the confirmation he needed. Emily was there. This stage of the investigation was like diving into a slow-motion nightmare. Each new piece of evidence seemed to bring them closer to the truth, but at the same time, it increased their despair, because if Emily was truly alive, it meant she had spent nearly 20 years confined in unimaginable conditions. How much longer would she survive? This question hammered at Michael's mind, leaving him in constant agony. The dossier now carried weight. Divergent floor plans, incompatible energy records, neighbors' accounts, suspicious recordings. It was a body of work that finally had the power to break through the authorities' negligence. But there was still a huge problem: convincing the justice system to act quickly. Robert warned that the longer it took, the greater the risk George would realize he was being investigated and eliminate all evidence. The desperate search for evidence was also a race against time. Michael was no longer living, merely surviving. Every second felt like an eternity. He stared at George's house as if gazing at an impenetrable fortress, knowing that within lay answers the world refused to see. And while Springfield went about its normal routine, with families dropping off children at school and neighbors trimming their fences, on that street lurked one of the greatest horrors the state of Missouri would ever know. And it was precisely at this point, when everything seemed to finally fall into place, that the most frustrating part came. Even with all these discoveries, when the documents were presented to the prosecution in 2022, the answer wasn't what Michael had hoped for. Because for the authorities, what they called definitive proof was still missing, and this new hurdle would turn hope into yet another painful disappointment. Even with all the material gathered, with the house plans showing areas non-existent in the official records, with energy consumption graphs indicating intense activity during times when George claimed to be away, and even with the recording showing a faint female voice echoing from inside the basement, the county prosecutor's office refused to budge. In February 2022, after months of waiting, and back and forth between lawyers, private investigators and family members, the official response arrived. The search warrant request was denied. The argument was direct and cold. The evidence was circumstantial. There was no concrete evidence that Emily was actually in the house. For Michael, it was like being punched in the gut. He had turned his life upside down, investing money, health, and family in this investigation, and now saw all his efforts thrown back to square one. When he received the notification, it took him a few minutes to process it. Robert, reading the document, closed his eyes and simply shook his head, as if he had seen this before. "They want a body, that's all," he muttered. The phrase echoed in Michael's mind, refusing to accept that Emily had to be dead for anyone to believe him. The frustration wasn't just personal. It was also a reflection of the system's slowness and bureaucracy. The paperwork that was supposed to protect victims ended up becoming barriers. Each signature, each denied stamp, was another brick in the wall that kept Emily trapped. The weight of it all ate away at Michael. He remembered all the sleepless nights, the arguments with his wife, the accumulating debts, the veiled threats he'd been receiving, and thought, all this for nothing? But at the same time, something inside him refused to stop. Behind the scenes, Robert tried to convince old FBI contacts to intervene, but without an official warrant, there was no legal way to act. Any direct attempt to enter the house could be considered trespassing, which would invalidate all the evidence. The irony was cruel. They were certain of what was there, but their hands were tied. It felt like running on an endless treadmill, always in the same place, while time passed and Emily's life remained locked somewhere underground. The court order's denial had another devastating effect. It further undermined the confidence of those who still believed in Michael. Some family members, tired of the endless struggle, began to distance themselves. They said it might be time to let go of the past, to accept that Emily would never return. His own wife, Rebecca, threatened to leave him for good, saying his obsession was destroying not only their marriage, but also the mental health of everyone around them. Michael found himself alone, fighting against a system that seemed to prefer silence to truth. But what hurt most was seeing George roaming freely around the neighborhood. He continued to mow the lawn, greet a few neighbors with that discreet smile, and shop at the local supermarket as if he were just another ordinary resident. For Michael, it was an insult, almost a provocation. The man he believed was holding his cousin captive lived with impunity, protected by concrete walls and the blindness of the authorities. Robert tried to remain calm, but he also felt the tension rising. He knew Michael was about to cross dangerous boundaries. In private conversations, he warned, "If you act on your own, you could lose everything. They won't believe you, they'll arrest you." But in Michael's heart, the thought of waiting any longer was unbearable. It had been 19 years since Emily had disappeared. How much longer did she have? This new frustration didn't halt the investigation, but it did change its tone. From that moment on, Michael began to act with even more urgency, as if each day were his last. There was no more room for patience. He knew he would need greater force to break the authorities' silence, and amidst the outrage, he began to realize that perhaps the only way out was to take the case to the public, expose everything, and apply pressure until there was no other alternative. It was in this climate of despair and anger, after the bitter disappointment of justice, that the chance to turn the tide arose. Because, if the doors of the law remained closed, another could open: the media, and with it the attention of the entire country. The turning point began almost unexpectedly in August 2023. After so many years of closed doors and formal denials, Michael realized that the only way to break the silence would be to expose everything to as many people as possible. It was then that he contacted a producer for the show. Ours, a CBS television series renowned for investigating complex criminal cases and giving voice to stories the justice system had refused to address. Initially, the news team approached the case cautiously. After all, 20 years had passed since Emily's disappearance, and the official version still claimed she was a teenager who had run away from home. But when Michael presented the complete dossier with conflicting maps, electrical records, construction receipts, and even the disturbing audio recordings near the vent in George's house, the reaction was immediate. There was a story that needed to be told. The first interview was recorded in secret at a hotel on the outskirts of Springfield. Michael spoke on camera with a choked voice, recalling years of frustration, the lonely struggle, the threats, and above all, the hope that his cousin was still alive. Aunt Susan, already weakened by age, also gave her testimony. Through tears, she repeated the phrase that had sustained her conviction from the beginning: "Emily is here. I feel it. I never believed she had run away." These words, spoken with such emotion, had a huge impact on the production team, who decided to fully immerse themselves in the research. When the episode finally aired, the effect was explosive. Millions of Americans watched the disturbing story, and within hours, the case gained national attention. Social media was filled with debates, theories, and public demands on Missouri authorities. The hashtag Justice for Emily spread across Twitter and Facebook, and within days, the pressure on local police reached a level that could no longer be ignored. It was impossible to keep the case buried. The media exposure had immediate consequences. Journalists from outlets such as New York Times and CNN began publicly questioning authorities about their negligence over the years. How could a reported disappearance in 2003 be handled so superficially? How could no one have thought to investigate the renovations George made shortly after his wife's death? How could neighbors' reports and even signs of movement in the basement be ignored? These questions echoed in headlines and editorials, embarrassing the Springfield Police and the local district attorney's office. The pressure became so intense that the case reached the United States Department of Justice. Given the repercussions, the narrative of voluntary escape was no longer viable. A special team was assigned to review all the evidence presented by Michael and Robert. Unlike the previous apathy, this time every detail was seriously analyzed. The report produced by the private investigator, previously seen as a conspiracy theory, was now treated as valuable material. It was in this context that the FBI officially entered the case. Together with SWAT and the Missouri Fire Department, a task force was formed with a clear objective: to conduct a search operation and determine once and for all whether Emily Johnson was, in fact, alive and hiding in the basement of her own home. This collaboration between different agencies was described as an unexpected alliance, a direct result of public pressure and media coverage. While all this was happening behind the scenes, George Johnson seemed to be living normally, but his calmness was no longer fooling anyone. The neighborhood, which had previously preferred to remain silent, was now restless. Some began reporting seeing George more nervous, pacing the yard at night, as if sensing something big was about to happen. Others said he had begun reinforcing the locks on his house, as if preparing to resist something. Michael watched every movement with his heart racing. For the first time in 2 decades, he felt the truth was near. But along with hope came fear that George, sensing the mounting pressure, might do something even more terrible to ensure Emily was never found. Time seemed to be running out, and each day without action represented a greater risk. Then, in September 2023, a search warrant was finally issued. The authorization that had been denied so many times was now signed under the weight of public opinion, television cameras, and federal presence. The document authorized a full-scale operation, including breaking and entering and excavating if necessary. Michael could hardly believe it when he received the news. He cried alone in the car, remembering all the sleepless nights and all the closed doors he'd faced. Susan, even weakened, smiled for the first time in years. The unlikely alliance between family, media, local authorities and federal agencies had changed the course of history. The city of Springfield, which had ignored the signs for so long, would now be the scene of one of the most dramatic operations ever seen in its history. And amid all this anticipation, a single question lingered. What exactly would be found behind that hidden hatch in George Johnson's basement? In the early hours of October 2nd, 2023, Springfield seemed like just another ordinary day, but on the street where George Johnson's house stood, the atmosphere was warlike. At 3 in the morning, silent patrol cars began to line up, lights off, officers in bulletproof vests and tense faces. SWAT, FBI, and the fire department were there not for just any raid, but for something even the most experienced knew they would never forget. The warrant was in hand, and the order was clear. Enter, search every corner, and find out once and for all if Emily Johnson was still alive. The silence of the operation was broken when the battering ram hit the front door. The boom echoed through the street, and the first teams rushed into the house, armed and alert. George offered no immediate resistance. He was found in the living room, sitting in an armchair, with a cold, almost calculated expression. He didn't scream, didn't run. He simply watched, as if he had known the moment would come. While he was handcuffed and removed from the premises, other agents quickly descended to the basement, the true target of the mission. The atmosphere was suffocating. The first impression was of abandonment. Poorly plastered walls, accumulated dust, old tools, discarded in corners. But one of the agents soon noticed a difference in texture in one part of the wall. It was as if there were a hidden division, a work done to disguise something. The men grabbed sledgehammers and began breaking up the concrete. With each blow, the sound echoed through the basement like a harbinger of the truth that was about to emerge. After minutes that felt like hours, the metal hatch appeared. Just as Robert had predicted, it was hidden beneath layers of cement and paint, barely visible. The smell that escaped as the first crack was opened made some of them flinch, a heavy, musty air permeated with years of accumulated moisture. Flashlights were lit, weapons raised, and the agents began descending a narrow staircase that seemed to lead to an endless tunnel. The space was claustrophobic, raw, concrete walls, dripping moisture, the sound of footsteps echoing as if they were inside a well. At the end of the corridor, a reinforced steel door with external locks confirmed that this was no simple warehouse. Here lay the answer to 2 decades of unanswered questions. When they broke down the door, the scene that unfolded froze even the most prepared. A small, suffocating underground room, lit only by a dim bulb. The floor was covered in food scraps, discarded packaging, and scattered old clothes, and in the corner, huddled, was a woman, thin, pale, with long, tangled hair and wearing torn clothes. Her eyes closed for a few seconds in the glare of the flashlights, as if unable to bear the light. But then she slowly opened them and faced the agents. She didn't say anything at first. She just blinked slowly, trying to figure out if this was real or another nightmare. One of the officers, overcome with emotion, knelt beside her and said, "You're safe now." Then a faint sound, almost a whisper, escaped her parched lips. "Is it over?" The simple phrase, but full of despair, pierced the silence and made many there hold back tears. There was no longer any doubt. After 20 years, Emily Johnson was alive. The shock was immediate. Radios began to blare with orders. Medics were rushed to the scene, and the rescue began. Some officers couldn't hide their emotion, and even veterans stepped back for a moment to breathe and contain the impact of the scene. This wasn't just a successful operation. It was a plunge into horror, and at the same time, the miracle of survival. Emily was carefully removed, carried on a makeshift stretcher, mumbling incoherently. She was dehydrated, malnourished, but conscious, and as they carried her out, the contrast was almost surreal. From the dark, suffocating basement, she was brought out into the cold dawn, illuminated by police car headlights and surrounded by people who finally saw in her no longer a fugitive, but a victim who had resisted against all odds. But even with the relief of the rescue, a sense of anguish hung in the air. Because even though Emily had been found alive, the question no one dared to ask aloud remained. What exactly did she experience during those 20 years in captivity? Emily was rushed to the Mercy Hospital Springfield, still confused, fragile, and disoriented. The ambulance ride seemed like a scene from reality. Lying on a stretcher, surrounded by paramedics monitoring her vital signs, she stared at the ceiling as if unable to believe she was actually leaving the underground cellar where she had spent almost her entire life. Outside, TV cameras were already recording everything. Journalists were gathering in front of the hospital, and Springfield, for the first time, was awakening to the true scale of the horror it had ignored for so long. During initial examinations, doctors found severe malnutrition, fragile bones from lack of sun exposure, anemia, and physical signs of prolonged confinement. There were old scars on her arms and wrists, signs of confinement that had never fully healed. Still, what most impressed the professionals was her lucidity. Emily seemed exhausted, but aware of everything that was happening. When asked her name, she quietly replied, "Emily Johnson." These were her first officially recorded words in freedom after 20 years. The reunion with her family was another devastating moment. Susan, the aunt who never gave up, entered the room accompanied by psychologists. Upon seeing her niece, her eyes immediately filled with tears. It took Emily a few seconds to recognize her, but when she realized who it was, she held out her trembling hand and whispered, "You never stopped looking for me." Susan burst into tears, confirming, without needing to say it, that the certainty she'd carried for years was now before her. Michael, nearby, wept silently, relieved to have finally been proven right, but devastated by the thought of lost time. The recovery process, however, would be much more complex than simply restoring her physical health. Psychologists who monitored Emily said she displayed signs of severe trauma, an intense fear of open spaces, difficulty maintaining eye contact for long periods of time, hypersensitivity to loud noises, and anxiety attacks when exposed to crowded environments. It was as if the prison had shaped every aspect of her mind. Emily was free, but she still carried the invisible bars of captivity. Even weakened, in private conversations with professionals, she gradually began to talk about life in the basement. She revealed that George visited her regularly, bringing food and imposing strict rules. She said she was constantly threatened, that any attempt to ask for help would be futile because no one would believe her. She repeated phrases that seemed to have been engraved in her mind by her father for years. "The world is dangerous. Here you are protected. No one cares about you out there." It was proof that George not only trapped her physically, but also tried to imprison her mentally. For the medical team, Emily's case became a dual challenge, restoring her weakened body and rebuilding her mind, scarred by isolation. She received intensive care from nutritionists, physical therapists, and psychiatrists. Every small step forward, like walking the hospital corridors without panicking or tolerating sunlight for a few minutes, was celebrated as a victory. But perhaps the most symbolic moment occurred days later when, still in the hospital, Emily was taken to a private indoor garden away from the cameras, feeling the sun on her. Faced for the first time in 2 decades, she closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and simply whispered, "I thought I'd never see the light again." The scene, recounted by nurses, was remembered as one of the most emotional moments of her entire recovery. The drama, however, was far from over, because as Emily regained her strength and began to speak, new details about George's motives and the routine of his captivity emerged, revelations that would shock everyone even further and show that the darkness of that basement was just part of a much larger nightmare. George Allen Johnson was soon formally charged. On the day October 12th, 2023, just 10 days after Emily's rescue, he was taken to the county courthouse amid shouts of protest from residents who now saw the quiet neighbor who had deceived everyone for years in a different light. Handcuffed, with his head down, he tried to maintain a cool demeanor, but the scene left no doubt. The man who walked the streets as if he were blameless was in fact the architect of one of the most brutal crimes in recent American history. The prosecution presented a set of heavy charges: first-degree kidnapping, false imprisonment, psychological and physical torture, and child abuse. The evidence was now irrefutable. The underground cellar, documented in photos, videos, and forensic reports, revealed a space designed for long-term confinement. The makeshift bed, food scraps, energy consumption records, and even Emily's personal items found. There were living proof of the crime. The victim herself, frail as she was, began to recount details that dismantled any attempt at a defense. The trial dragged on until April 2024 and was closely followed by the national press. At each session, neighbors and onlookers gathered at the courthouse doors. The entire country wanted to understand how such a brutal crime could remain hidden for 20 years under the noses of the authorities. George tried to maintain a narrative that he was protecting his daughter from the outside world, claiming she wasn't ready to live alone. But his argument sounded delusional, almost grotesque compared to Emily's emotional accounts. In tears, she recounted how she spent most of her time without seeing sunlight, living under constant threat, that if she tried to run away or ask for help, no one would believe her. The sentence was exemplary. Life imprisonment without parole. George was transferred to a maximum security prison, and his name was permanently entered into criminal records as a symbol of the monstrosity hidden behind the veneer of normalcy. Springfield, which had remained silent for years, now bore the mark of being the scene of one of the greatest horrors in its history. Emily, on the other hand, began a slow process of reconstruction. Under a protected identity, she moved to another city with support from federal victim protection programs. She began intensive psychological counseling and, surprisingly, began participating in awareness campaigns about domestic violence and kidnapping. Her testimony, even though often masked by a distorted voice or in interviews without images, gained traction. She became a symbol of resistance, of survival, but also of warning. Monsters sometimes lived next door, in ordinary homes, hiding unimaginable horrors behind closed curtains. The epilogue to this story is more than closure. It's a stark reflection on how institutional failures, the neglect of authorities, and The silence of a community can allow such crimes to persist for years, but it's also a reminder of the strength of those who refuse to give up. If it weren't for Michael's persistence, Susan's unwavering faith, and Emily's courage in resisting, this story might never have come to light. This video brought you every detail of a true story, filled with mystery, pain, and survival, and now you know how much secrets like these can be closer than we imagine. Stories like Emily's move us, making us reflect on what might be hidden behind ordinary doors, and that's precisely why sharing this content is so important. When you like and subscribe, it's not just a gesture for the channel, it's also a way to give more people access to these stories that for so long have remained silent. It's as if together we're breaking down these invisible walls and giving a voice to those who have never been heard. Write the word here in the comments true, because that's exactly what we're working for. Together, to bring to light truths the world has tried to erase. And get ready, because the next video will delve into an even more disturbing case, full of unexpected twists and turns and secrets revealed when you least expect them. It's right there on the screen. Just click and stay with me, because the story that follows is one that makes your heart race and keeps you hooked until the very last second.